This is a University of Otago podcast.
Inga mana inga reo, inga tā wira pumanawa, ro rakatirama, tena koto, tena tato katoa. My name is Harlene Hain, and I have the great privilege of being the Vice Chancellor here at the University of Otago. And on behalf of the university, it is my great pleasure to warmly welcome you to Jon Hall's IPL. At the beginning of the year, I had the privilege of welcoming incoming students to the University of Otago. And these students, and there were literally hundreds of them, represent some of the best, the brightest, and the most talented young people in this country. For each of these welcomes, the academic staff and I wore our academic regalia. And I told the students that although this is the kind of clothing that was typically worn by professors while they were teaching, now we reserve this academic regalia for special occasions. So I alerted students to the fact that when they see us dressed like this, something important is about to happen. And tonight, as you can see, we're wearing academic regalia, and something important is about to happen. As a community, we have gathered together to celebrate an important milestone in Jon Hall's career. Tonight, we are here to celebrate his promotion to professor and to listen to his lecture that will give us a taste of his outstanding scholarship. So, what is so important about promotion to professor that warrants all this fancy clothing? Well, the rank of professor represents the pinnacle of academic achievement. And at Otago, it is only achieved on the back of sustained excellence in research, teaching, and service. Jon, like all of the professors who are here with us this evening, has excelled in all three of these areas. He is a gifted scholar, he is an extremely popular and effective teacher, and he has provided excellent service to his department and to his discipline. Jon, on behalf of the University of Otago, I would like to warmly congratulate you on your well-deserved promotion to professor. And I will now call on Professor Tony Ballantyne, the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Humanities, to tell us just a bit more about Jon's journey to professor. Norera tena koto, tena tato katoa.
Tena koto katoa. I'm really delighted to be able to introduce Professor Jon Hall. Like so many of our academic staff here at Otago, Jon's trajectory has been truly global. He was born in the north of England, in Lancashire, to parents who were from Yorkshire, but grew up in the south, in southwest London. But I think it's true to say that as a teenager, young Jon Hall probably wasn't thinking about a teaching career that would take him to Dunedin. In fact, I asked Jon just before about what his awareness of New Zealand was growing up, and he said two things. One, Anchor Butter, and two, Bevan Congdon scoring 175 at Lord's. And I was delighted that the strong early memory of New Zealand was a moment of great sporting prowess rather than failure. After developing a strong commitment to classical languages at high school, Jon pursued his undergraduate and then his MA studies in classics at St Andrews before travelling southwest, a long way southwest, across the Atlantic to the University of Texas at Austin for his PhD studies. He came to Otago in 1993 and has risen through the ranks, serving as the head of the Department of Classics since 2013. Jon has published many journal articles and book chapters, and he has also written two very important books, Politeness and Politics in Cicero's Letters, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2009, and Cicero's Use of Judicial Theatre from the University of Michigan Press in 2014. Together with Bill Dominic, his former colleague in our classics department, he also edited the Blackwell Companion to Roman Rhetoric, which was published in 2007. Reviewers of his work and his scholarly peers consistently praise Jon's work, highlighting his nuanced readings of texts, his carefully constructed arguments, and his eloquent prose. Jon has also been an innovative teacher, experimenting with performance and new technologies as pedagogical tools, producing 2 videos of performances of Cicero's speeches. Jon is quite simply a very highly respected member of our division, an excellent researcher, a fine teacher, and a very good head of department. He is a real all-rounder, to carry on the cricket metaphors, and is held in very high esteem. And I know that all of you gathered here, like me, are very much looking forward to hearing him talk about murderous politeness in ancient Rome. Jon.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor. Thank you, Tony. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you all for coming. I know you've already done a full day's work. So I've never delivered exactly this type of lecture before, for obvious reasons, and I've spent quite a while wrestling with what I should say. Fortunately, the organisers are prudent enough to provide some guidelines for these events, and these have assured me that my audience would be, quote, intelligent and attentive. Looking around, I can see that this may be true. I should begin perhaps with a reassurance to those of you who have attended one of my public lectures before. I promise that I won't be taking off my trousers and whipping out my toga. I'm sorry if this is a great disappointment to anyone, but as you can see tonight, I don't actually need a toga as a silly form of costume. Besides assuring me of the intelligence of my audience, the lecture guidelines also suggested that I talk about my research over the years, with some comment perhaps on people or events that have helped to shape my career. So for the first few minutes, I'd like to fill in some background about how I first got interested in the classics. I'll then explore the topic of my first book, from which the title of my lecture derives. And finally, I'll spend a few minutes at the end talking about Cicero's use of judicial theatre, the subject of my second book. So how did I get here? Well, from one perspective, it's all gone horribly wrong. My first ambition at school, in line with that of 23,000 other kids growing up in the suburbs of London, was to be a professional soccer player. If you came to this lecture expecting to hear something about ancient history, here we have it. 1970. Plans for this glittering career, however, were interrupted when I was introduced to the wonderful world of books. I don't recall much about this photo, except that the shirt was 100% nylon and the tie was elasticated. The extant photographic record shows, though, that by the age of 12, when I went to the local grammar school, I had in fact mastered the skill of tying my own tie. Hampton Grammar School, now just Hampton, was a decent school, although by no means high-flying academically. Fortunately, it offered both Latin and Greek, and my teacher there, Joe Dalton, played an important role in getting me interested in the subtleties of language. I should also give my parents considerable credit for their attitude towards my studies at this time, not so much for what they did, as for what they didn't do. When I expressed an interest in studying Greek at 13, rather than German or Spanish, and doing Latin and Greek at O-level, then at A-level, then at university, they didn't try to steer me towards more practical subjects. The response was always, "That's okay, dear, just do whatever interests you." Their willingness to let me explore my interests and feel good about it was crucial, although I didn't realize the stress that this path actually caused them until my final year as a postgraduate student at Texas. While my parents were visiting me in Austin, I invited my mother to take a look around my apartment. She chose instead to stay in the car. When I grumbled to my father about her being too lazy to get out and climb the stairs, he replied, "Oh, it's not that. She's just worried she'll get upset when she sees how you're living." Having a son in his late 20s living in a grungy student flat was evidently quite a worry for her. After all, many of my peers back in London had settled jobs, wives, and mortgages. I realized for the first time that in the eyes of other coffee morning mums, I was potentially a loser. But until that point, my parents had managed to conceal such anxieties very well. This photo is a good reminder that before punk in 1976, most people in the 70s actually wore their hair pretty long. Indeed, as the next photo shows, punk seems to have passed by my school entirely. Rather than agitate for anarchy in the UK, we were, as our haircuts show, more inclined simply to blame it on the boogie. After grammar school, as you've heard, I pursued a classics degree at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. When I was asked in my final year whether I was considering higher study, I was rather hesitant. I had to say that most of my lecturers in Scotland seemed to me rather desiccated people, remote and crusty, not anyone that I'd aspire to be. Moreover, it was the time of Thatcher's attacks on the universities in the UK, which had led to the Professor of Latin to shoot himself on Saturday afternoon during my first year there. So my cautious response was, yes, further study perhaps, but how about overseas? At this point, fate stepped in the shape of Ian Kidd, the professor of Greek. He mentioned that he'd spent a year as a distinguished visitor at the University of Texas, and that as one of the largest classics departments in the USA, they had lots of money to award to postgraduates. Why not give it a go, he suggested. So I did. They gave me money, so I went. This move was crucial for broadening my academic horizons. There was a postgraduate cohort of some 40 very bright students. I was exposed to the excitement and madness of literary theory, and I went to Italy for several summers to take part in the archaeological excavation of an ancient Greek cemetery, a project that led to my first publications. There were, however, some risks involved in this kind of travel. This slide shows the dangers of going to the barbers in Italy in the 1980s. Thanks to my trusting nature, I ended up with something perilously close to a mullet. Although, to be fair, this did kind of match the Miami Vice Don Johnson vibe that I seem to have been cultivating at the time with my linen jacket and rolled-up sleeves. While studying at Texas, I came to the conclusion that despite all these interesting facets of the classical world, what really fascinated me was Cicero's letters and dialogues. This was primarily because they gave exciting glimpses into what life in ancient Rome was actually like. Art, myths, and historical narratives are all very well, but I've always been drawn to the smaller elements of social interaction that make up the fundamental business of everyday life. And Cicero's letters and dialogues offer a remarkable window onto this aspect of ancient Rome. Which brings me at last to murderous politeness. When I mentioned to my students that we still possess the texts of letters exchanged between ancient Romans, many are, quite rightly, amazed that such documents have survived over 2 millennia. When it comes to the collection of letters found near Hadrian's Wall in England, at a place called Vindolanda, it really is the case that we possess the very bits of paper that the soldiers wrote on. Actually, not pieces of paper, but very fine slivers of wood laced together. These are the so-called Vindolanda tablets, and they provide some fascinating information about the life of these soldiers stationed at a chilly and windswept frontier outpost of the Roman Empire. One famously details the contents of a care package. The text is fragmentary, but we can just about discern the following. We have to supply a verb, perhaps, so I have sent you, and then probably pairs of socks from Satua, 2 pairs of sandals, and 2 pairs of underpants. That's what friends are for. And another letter fragment is no less revealing. Cervesam commilitones non habunt quam rogo jubias miti. Commilitones seems to mean those who are soldiers with me, my fellow soldiers. Habunt, they have, simple enough. Anybody flinch just then? This is a second conjugation verb. Habeo habere. The form should be habunt, not habunt. My fellow soldiers do not have cervezam. Well, I believe the Vice-Chancellor speaks Spanish. Any ideas? Cervezam? Beer. My messmates don't have any beer. Please ask for some to be sent. Beer and underpants. One feels here the hand of the human condition stretching across 2,000 years from the young Roman soldier on the Scottish borders to the undergraduate student at the University of Otago. But perhaps the greatest collection of Latin letters is that of the great Roman writer and statesman Cicero, who lived in the 1st century BC. In his case, we don't actually possess any bits of papyrus from 50 BC that he himself wrote on. Our text has been preserved instead via copies of copies of copies, stretching back to the Middle Ages and then ultimately to edited collections that were circulated in Rome soon after his death. And these letters were circulated primarily because his contemporaries recognized their great historical and political value, not least because the collection contains letters that he wrote to powerful men such as Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and Marcus Brutus. And in certain cases, we have some of their replies too. They thus afford a unique insight into the way in which Roman aristocrats interacted, how they spoke and wrote to each other. And it is at this point that politeness comes into the picture. It's easy, perhaps, to trivialize politeness as simply minding one's P's and Q's, behaving nicely, mastering everyday social courtesies such as saying please and thank you at the appropriate time. Over the last 30 years or so, however, modern sociolinguists have demonstrated that polite language is much more than this. Certainly, one prime purpose of language is to convey helpful, factual information. It's lunchtime, for example, or that rotating knife is about to cut your hand off. But in most societies, language also conveys information about social relationships of the interlocutors. The precise linguistic forms that we select often convey a degree of respect to the addressee, or conversely, a degree of intimacy. These linguistic choices help to facilitate social interaction. Not enough respect, and people may feel insulted. Conversely, if you adopt a highly formal manner among fairly close acquaintances, you can be perceived as inappropriately standoffish or English. And when people start to feel insulted, the social stakes are raised. Tension ensues. People start to pick fights. Politeness, then, is not just about saying please and thank you. As modern sociolinguists have made clear, it's about the management and maintenance of social relationships. So for the next few minutes, I'd like to consider 6 examples from Cicero's world that help to show what was at stake for the Romans, for the Roman aristocrat, when it came to matters of politeness. The first 2 involve Julius Caesar and his interaction with prominent Romans when he was dictator. And they show that concerns with politeness did not just involve communication by letter, they suffused many aspects of daily life. So we need a little political background, perhaps, in order to understand these examples. Caesar's famous conquest of Gaul between 59 and 49 BC ultimately provoked a political crisis in Italy, leading to a catastrophic civil war against his main opponent, Gnaeus Pompey. Caesar ultimately prevailed, and upon his return to Rome, spent several years trying to re-establish orderly government. This was not an easy task. Bitter animosities remained among the survivors who had opposed him, a group that included Cicero. And when Caesar assumed the position of permanent dictator in 46 BC, tensions heightened still further, until eventually he was assassinated on the Ides of March 44 BC by Brutus, Cassius, and a group of fellow conspirators. According to the Roman biographer Suetonius, the following incident took place shortly before the assassination. But it was the following action in particular that roused deadly hatred against Caesar. When the Senate approached him in a body with many highly honorary decrees, he received them before the temple of Venus Genetrix without rising. As an undergraduate, I remember being surprised when a lecturer asked whether this act of impoliteness was what had provoked the fatal stabbing of the Ides of March. Surely, I thought, you don't kill somebody just because of a social faux pas. If this were the case, the world would be littered with corpses of the unfortunately gauche. And yet it is clear that the Romans took the incident very seriously. Suetonius goes on to mention 2 opposing interpretations of what actually happened, a sign that there were urgent partisan discussions of the event at the time. Caesar's failure to rise from his chair was seen not as some careless lapse in arcane etiquette, but as a personal insult to the honor and prestige of the powerful men approaching him. One-man rule might just be palatable, perhaps, if the dictator treated those around him with some respect. But show contempt in public, and you are going to create problems for yourself. The second example involves an anecdote reported in one of Cicero's letters written shortly after the assassination. You'll see that I've included the Latin text on my slides. This is primarily to impress on any students here the value of learning Latin and Greek. Master these languages and they'll take you places. In 2014, one of our students, Tommy Davis, won scholarships for PhD studying classics at Harvard, Texas, Columbia, Yale, and Princeton. And this success was based largely on the mastery of Latin and Greek. I should also mention that a recent study has shown that studying Greek and Latin actually makes you better looking. The main evidence for this is the actor Tom Hiddleston. He studied Greek and Latin at university, and as far as I'm aware, was pretty ordinary looking before he did that. But I digress. One fascinating feature of this second example is that it confirms what we might well have suspected on the basis of human nature. That in the aftermath of Caesar's sensational assassination, people sat around going, wow, can you believe what just happened? I knew Caesar had pissed off a few people, but still. It was probably in such a context that a friend of Cicero's called Mattius recounted the following scene. Mattius told me also that recently, when I called on Caesar and was sitting waiting to be summoned, Caesar remarked, I must be a most hated man. There's Marcus Cicero sitting waiting and can't get to see me at his own convenience. He is the most easygoing of mankind, but I don't doubt he detests me. Again, it seems that Caesar was not managing his social niceties very well. Cicero was an important man. To be sure, he had fought on the wrong side in the Civil War, and so his political stock had taken a significant hit. But he was still a former consul and formidable orator. He was not the kind of man who should be kept waiting for an interview. And yet Caesar's administrative life as dictator was so busy that gaining access to him was not easy. A minor irritation perhaps from our modern perspective, but it is clear that Caesar himself was well aware of the ill will that this kind of rudeness could generate. I must be a most hated man, sumo in odio sim. The dramatic irony of that remark is, of course, the point of the anecdote. The dictator, although aware of this hatred, could not fully comprehend its possible consequences. But more importantly for us, the incident shows how sensitive posh Romans were to matters of etiquette. As Mattius reports, Caesar, in fact, considered Cicero very easygoing, vacuous. The implication is that other aristocrats typically swaggered around with a much greater sense of self-entitlement. They felt keenly anything that could be perceived as an insult. It was not smart keeping pompous young men waiting a long time to see you. Such impoliteness could kill you. My next two examples involve one of Caesar's main political opponents, Marcus Claudius Marcellus, who served as consul in 51 BC. When Marcellus found himself on the losing side of the civil war, he retreated to a form of exile on an island near the coast of Turkey. Eventually, he was granted permission by Caesar to return to Rome, but in an incident that shocked his contemporaries, he never actually made it back home. On his return journey, he was stabbed to death by an acquaintance called Magius. Immediately following the murder, there was naturally considerable speculation regarding Magius's motives. There was the inevitable conspiracy theory that Caesar himself had arranged the killing, but Cicero didn't believe a word of it. Instead, in a letter to his friend Atticus, he offers the following explanation. And no doubt that was it. Magius was financially ruined. I expect he asked Marcellus to do something for him and got a rather firm answer, as was Marcellus's way. In this scenario, then, Cicero imagines Magius asking Marcellus for a loan to help him out of his financial difficulties. And when he received a rather abrupt rebuff, he stabbed Marcellus to death. Again, this impoliteness thing, it could kill you. For as Cicero imagines it, it was not just the refusal of financial assistance that provoked such a violent response, it was the manner that this refusal took. Marcellus, he supposes, refused Constantius rather firmly, as was his custom, Cicero adds. Presumably, Cicero himself had witnessed at first hand Marcellus acting in a rather arrogant, uncompromising way. And evidently, he could understand how such a sharp refusal could provoke a desperate man to murder. Now, the management of refusals makes up one distinct subsection within modern studies of politeness. They are tricky things to effect satisfactorily, and it is clear that other Romans were well aware of these social challenges. Indeed, Cicero's own brother, in a treatise on how to win political elections, offers the following advice. You must refuse your friend's request graciously, making clear your obligation to him, showing how sorry you are, assuring the man that you will patch it all up in other ways. This is, of course, virtually the opposite of responding Constantius. The tactful man goes out of his way to show his regret at not being able to help an acquaintance. Refusing requests graciously was thus something of a refined social art, as Quintus goes on to observe. I've heard someone say this about certain advocates whom he had asked to take on his case, that he was more gratified by the words of the one who refused him than by those of him who accepted. For people are charmed more by one's manner and words than by the actual favour itself. But it seems that Marcellus did not particularly care about such niceties. As a member of one of Rome's most prestigious families, he had been able perhaps to disregard the feelings of his social inferiors without any consequences. But in Magius's case, he seems to have misjudged badly. His abruptness proved the last straw. Take that, you miserable and arrogant son of a bitch. But we can develop this picture a little further. We are fortunate enough to possess several letters exchanged between Cicero and Marcellus in 46 BC as the latter planned his return from exile. When Caesar agreed in September to allow Marcellus to return to Rome, Cicero wrote urging him to accept the offer. The letter, however, posed numerous challenges. First, he was trying to offer advice to an ex-consul from one of Rome's poshest families. This presumption might not go down too well. Second, he somehow had to make a good case for Marcellus's return without appearing too critical of the man's previous course of opposing Caesar. And third, as we've just seen, there was the tricky matter of Marcellus's arrogant character. Here is how Cicero begins the letter. There isn't any room for the English. That's partly the point, as we'll see in a minute. Although I understand that up until now you have followed a policy such as I would not dare to criticize, not that I do not disagree with it, but because I considered you to be endowed with such wisdom that I would not place my advice ahead of your own. Nevertheless, both the length of our friendship and your notable goodwill towards me, which has been evident ever since your boyhood, have urged me to write what I consider to be conducive to your welfare and just not incompatible with your prestige. This English translation matches the awkwardness of the Latin, one long, rather contorted sentence of some 71 words. Now, this sentence is an excellent example of what some sociolinguists term face work. That is, language that is designed primarily to save or pay respect to the face of the recipient. When the writer of a letter has to undertake a delicate piece of social business, such as offering advice to an important person, there is a lot of preparatory work to do. A sort of ceremonial politeness is required to make sure the recipient does not take offense. Hence Cicero's phrase, I would not dare to criticize, followed by an explicit acknowledgement of Marcellus's wisdom and a claim that Cicero would never place his own judgment ahead of his correspondence. All this is necessary precisely because Cicero does, in fact, go on to offer some advice, but he takes care to hedge this task around with linguistic strategies designed to make it less irritating. It is the subtleties of such strategies that in fact form the main focus of my book, and I'll be the first to admit that this kind of linguistic analysis doesn't translate too well to this type of lecture. So I'll pass over the close readings of the Latin text that make up a good part of my discussion and finish instead with a couple of examples that may give at least a flavour of my general approach. Perhaps my favourite example of murderous politeness involves the leaders of the conspiracy against Caesar, Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius. Following Caesar's assassination, there was a power vacuum that various ambitious politicians tried to exploit. And some 5 months later, we find Brutus and Cassius butting heads with the consul Mark Antony. This conflict was conducted in part through the public dissemination of open letters between the two sides. As part of this propaganda war, Antony seems to have launched a furious tirade against Brutus and Cassius in an apparently deliberate divergence from the use of polite diplomatic language. The response of Brutus and Cassius is fascinating. One option, of course, was to respond in kind, with angry insults. Instead, they show themselves to be masters of polite intimidation. This skill is seen most clearly in the final paragraph of one of their letters. After 2 sections of restrained self-assertion, the letter concludes, "This is our view. We are very eager for you to hold an important and respected position in a free republic. And we are not trying to provoke you to enmity." This all seems very reasonable. Brutus and Cassius seem to show a degree of goodwill towards Antony and offer a reassurance that they do not seek conflict. But they add one crucial condition: political freedom must take priority. At the same time, we value our freedom more than your friendship. Indeed, this assertiveness takes on a rather more sinister twist with the remark that follows. "Bear in mind not how long Caesar lived, but how short a time he reigned as king." And there it is, murderous politeness. It's worth reading again, slowly. "Bear in mind not how long Caesar lived, but for how short a time he reigned as king," which translated into direct English means, "Try to seize regal power for yourself and we'll kill you, just as we did Caesar." But the sentence's sophistication resides precisely in its polite indirectness. There are no obvious references to violence and no openly threatening language. The effect hinges rather on a contrast in thought between lived and reigned as king, complemented by a second contrast, not how long, but for how short a time. The conspirators demonstrate that there is more than one way to strike an intimidatory pose. They were men who could plunge a dagger into Caesar while staring him in the eye, but who also had a sophisticated grasp of the power of polite language. My final example dates to a few months later, in December 44, and involves Cicero's attempts to negotiate by letter with a politician named Murderous Politeness. Plancus was in charge of several legions in Gaul, and Cicero was trying to persuade him to use them in the service of the senatorial cause rather than the cause of Mark Antony. In this case, we encounter a rather different form of politeness, language used not to convey respect, but to foster a degree of intimacy between the two parties involved, language that brings individuals together. In one letter, Plancus writes as follows: "In my view, I cannot overlook even the slightest obligation to you without incurring the greatest blame. I have many reasons for this observance: your relations with my father, the respect I have paid you since childhood, and your reciprocal affection for me." We catch here a glimpse of the cynical nature of political negotiation at Rome. Plancus is in fact coolly matching Cicero's own attempts at diplomatic courtship in an earlier letter. In this letter, Cicero had himself invoked his relationship with Plancus's father, his long-standing respect for Plancus, and their great mutual affection. But Plancus does not just perfunctorily match Cicero's overtures point for point. He affects to place himself willingly in a position subordinate to the elder man. "Therefore, my dear Cicero, be convinced that as our respective ages allow, in cultivating your friendship, I have invested you, and only you, with the sacred character of a father." This is a remarkable gambit. Roman politicians were notoriously competitive. But here, apparently, we have an enthusiastic team player. Indeed, he goes on to proffer exactly the kind of declaration of political allegiance that Cicero was hoping for. "Therefore, convince yourself of one thing. All that my strength can essay, my prudence foresee, and my counsel suggest shall ever be at the service of the Commonwealth." What a nice, polite man. And yet this politeness, too, was, in a sense, murderous, or at least treacherous. Within a few months, Plancus had reneged on his promise and joined forces with Mark Antony. All is fair in love and war, I suppose. But the eventual outcomes were momentous. Plancus lived on to forge a successful career with the Emperor Augustus and was able to leave behind an imposing mausoleum on the coast of Italy that still survives today. And he is still commemorated in the town hall of Bâle in Switzerland, a town that he has supposedly founded. No less importantly, Plancus helped Mark Antony to achieve political dominance. And within a few months, Cicero was murdered, his head cut off by Antony's henchmen. It's a famous depiction of Antony's wife playing with the head of Cicero, who has little pins stuck in his mouth in revenge for the speeches he delivered against Mark Antony. The second main focus of my research is rather different, although it likewise deals with Cicero. As well as being a letter writer, Cicero was the most accomplished orator of his day. He delivered speeches in the Senate, in the law courts, and in public political assemblies, many of which he wrote up and published. We have some 58 that we could read today. These speeches have been scrutinized and studied by scholars for centuries. But this focus has tended to be primarily textual and historical, with an emphasis on language, grammar, and literary style. Far less attention has been paid to the speeches as live oratorical events, as performances brought to life through oral delivery, the orator's movements and gestures, and his lively interaction with the audience. My interest in this aspect of the speech is derived in part from the influence of Gareth Morgan, a professor at the University of Texas, who held daily noontime readings of Homer and Virgil in his office. No translation, just reading out loud the Greek or Latin for 50 minutes. This usually meant a book or two of Homer in a session, or half a book of Virgil. So within a month or so, we'd have read one of the greatest epics in its entirety in the original language. Of course, we didn't necessarily understand every word or even every sentence, but it was a fantastic way of becoming immersed in the flow and rhythm of the Greek and Latin hexameter. In recent years, there has been an increasing appreciation among modern scholars of the need to understand the dynamics of these original performances if we want to understand their full artistic impact. Indeed, in the year 2000, John Barsby, former professor in the classics department here, organized a conference at Otago to explore further some of these considerations. It was partly as a result of the discussions there that I decided that these aspects of Ciceronian oratory deserved closer study. One approach to this question is to study all the ancient sources that discuss these issues and formulate some conclusions on this basis. And this is what I did in a chapter written for a book on Roman rhetoric that I also co-edited. But when it comes to issues of performance, the study of theoretical texts will get you only so far. As I'd learned from my readings of Homer and Virgil with Gareth Morgan, to fully understand the dynamics and challenges of the original literature, you have to speak it out loud. And in the case of Cicero, while wearing a toga. So with the help of a modest Otago research grant, I set about experimenting with the practicalities of Roman oratory. The first experiment was conducted with the assistance of Robin Bond from the University of Canterbury and explored passages from several of Cicero's speeches, delivered in Latin and scored with the typical gestures that Roman orators typically made. In the second, I played Cicero myself, delivering the whole of his speech in defense of Archias in Latin. One purpose of this DVD was pedagogical. I was aware that high schools in the US had just adopted the speech as a set text for study, and that many high school teachers were not especially confident in their ability at spoken Latin. The aim then was to provide them with a teaching resource that would help to convey to students that the speech was originally part of a dynamic performance, not a text to be treated merely as a frustrating exercise in translation. Now, as far as publishers are concerned, it's true that Latin is a bit of a niche market. And Cicero, well, he's a niche within that. A DVD of one of his speeches in Latin, well, let's use the polite term, esoteric. Yet I'm happy to report a degree of market penetration, at least within Oregon. A few years ago, we had an exchange student here from Oregon studying Latin. And she mentioned that a high school teacher had mentioned a DVD by some academic in New Zealand performing Cicero. Did I know who that was? Yes, I did. And this year, I received a royalty check for $20. US. Enough to buy me almost 2 pints of Emerson's at Eureka. But in addition to the pedagogical aim, there was also an exploratory research goal. Actually performing these orations made me think harder about the practical business of staging a defense in the Roman law courts and the various effects that Cicero was trying to achieve. And this in turn led to my book on judicial theatre. Let me just look at a couple of examples and then we'll bring the talk to a close. Perhaps one of the most startling aspects of Roman trials to the modern lawyer is the license granted to theatrical appeals for pity, usually at the end of a defense. One of Cicero's most ambitious examples is found in his speech on behalf of the military commander named Marcus Pontius, who was accused of corruption while governor of Gaul. From the surviving text, we can conclude that Cicero contrived a pitiful family scene as his emotional climax. Surely the Gallic leader will not, as you all look on, wrench and tear away this man from the embrace of his mother, a most distinguished yet most unhappy woman. We were to imagine then that Cicero has brought forward Pontius and his mother in front of the jurors, clinging to each other in an embrace. But he didn't stop there. Pontius' sister, we learn, is also present, clinging to him on the other side. Especially since on the other side, a Vestal Virgin holds her blood brother in her embrace and implores your protection, gentlemen, and that of the Roman people. The grand emotion of this scene then reaches a climax as Pontius himself bursts into tears when confronted with this depiction of family piety. Members of the jury, do you see how Marcus Pontius, a very brave man, has suddenly poured forth tears at the mention of his parent and his sister? Behind this bold piece of showmanship, there must have lain a good deal of technique and planning. Cicero tells us that he would have detailed discussions with his client in order to probe the legal strengths and weaknesses of the case. But we know very little about how he put in place these more practical aspects of staging. Presumably, his first task was to assess what familial resources he had at his disposal. In the case of Pontius, he was very lucky. He had a defendant who was prepared to burst into tears, an Italian man who was prepared to burst into tears in public, and a mother and Vestal Virgin sister willing to plead pitifully with the jurors. It is clear in other instances, however, that the defendant refused to cooperate with this kind of plea. In Cicero's defense of Publius Cestius in 56 BC, for example, there are barely any references at all in this final appeal to the defendant, a man who was known to surround himself with gangs of thugs. He's not going to cry in front of anybody. So what was Cicero to do in these circumstances? Well, he meets the challenge with canny creativity. If the elder Cestius was not going to participate in pitiful theatrics, Cicero at least could try to gain some advantage from the defendant's teenage son. Thus, towards the start of the speech, he arranges for the young man to read out a decree from the town of Capua. Lucius Cestius, please read out what the councillors at Capua decreed, so that your voice, although still boyish today, can give an indication to your enemies of what it is likely to achieve when it has matured. Cicero's choice of speaker here is entirely manipulative. He could have asked the clerk of the court to read out the decree, or he could have done so himself. Instead, he makes an astute bid for the jurors' sympathy and admiration. To most fathers on the jury, which would have comprised about 50 middle-aged males, the young man's confident performance must have exemplified the kind of filial duty they hoped for in their own sons. The lad was appearing in front of the Roman public and speaking with poise and assurance on behalf of his father. Even if the jurors at this stage of the trial had doubts about the moral worth of the elder Cestius, and the prosecution would have spent a lot of time raising prejudice against him, they should at least respond warmly to this endearing picture of filial devotion. Perhaps the corrupt politician in front of them was not wholly bad after all. Cicero's defense of Milo, another political gangster who controlled a posse of thugs, required yet further ingenuity. Milo, like Cestius, wasn't going to cry in public. and he doesn't seem to have provided any members of his family for Cicero to exploit either. Cicero's solution? Find a way to plausibly break down in tears himself. He tries to generate pity by drawing attention to his own terrible plight if Milo is convicted and exiled. This is an indication, of course, of Cicero's belief in the effectiveness of judicial theatrics. He will try to insert a tearful plea any which way he can. But such a tour de force requires rehearsal, a real flair for acting, and a decent amount of chutzpah. A slight stumble or hesitation, either in the scene with Pontius and his family or in his defense of Milo, would have had a disastrous effect. And yet it is precisely this aspect of his skill that vanishes all too quickly when a 3D performance is flattened into the two-dimensional texts that we read today. My book, I hope, offers some way of helping us to appreciate Cicero's brilliance in this facet of oratory. So, time to bring things to a conclusion with some thanks and acknowledgements. Quite a few colleagues who were in the department when I first arrived here have now retired, but I'd like to thank John Barsby, Robin Hankey, John Garthwaite, Bill Dominic, and Pat and Robert Hanna for their support during the early stages of my career. From the philosophy department, Alan Musgrave and David Ward had taught me a good deal about life over the years, but sadly a good deal less about putting, chipping, and driving. I couldn't have written my books without the wisdom and support of Professor Nicola Redmond, and I owe thanks also to my current colleagues, Shona, Dan, Sean, Gwyneth, Pat, and Arlene, for their efforts in helping to rebuild and reshape our curriculum during a period of considerable transition. Because of your positive attitude, it has actually been a rewarding time to be a head of department. And as one of the panel members in the recent university review of our department noted, in a year's time or so, we should be the only classics department in New Zealand, and probably in Australasia too, in which every lecturer has published a monograph in their own research. So thanks for your willingness to take a few risks, and for completing the paperwork in a timely fashion. And thanks finally to everyone else for coming and helping me to celebrate the occasion. It's much appreciated. Please come over to the staff club in a few minutes for a drink. Thank you.
So, John, it's my great pleasure to deliver a vote of thanks to you. I think John has really delivered an outstanding lecture, providing rich insights into the development of his research and taking us on a journey with him through the kind of interpretive processes that are at the heart of his thought and his writing. He has taken us on some other journeys too, noting the influence of those good teachers and influential academic mentors that have shaped his academic development. After listening to many IPLs, this really is a recurring concern, the vital role played by great teachers, whether they are high school teachers like John's Mr. Dalton, great teachers in the undergraduate lecture theatre, or in postgraduate supervision like your Professor Morgan. These teachers really imprint the way our thought develops and our pathway into the world. And that's a really wonderful thing for us all to reflect on as teachers and educators. But John has taken us on some other journeys too. This evening, I think we have had the pleasure of witnessing something of a visual symphony of haircuts and sartorial experiments that are unrivaled in the history of humanities IPL.
Thank you very much.
The Don Johnson look in Italy was particularly special, I thought, John. But as it has been very clear, John has a lovely line and self-deprecating humour, and his lecture has laced wit and serious academic insight together extremely effectively. For me, I think I will carry three things away from the lecture tonight. First is a very strong impression of John's fine appreciation for language and his deep commitment to the value of close and careful reading of texts and oratorical performances that animates John's work. Second, the ways in which textual analysis can open up very rich portals into questions of cultural difference including those cultural formations that are very far from us, both in time and in place. And for me, this demonstrates one of the core capacities and contributions of humanities research. Third, he has underlined once again the very strong feedback loops that exist between teaching and research. He embodies a very important ideal here at Otago, that our research leaders should be deeply committed to their mission as teachers. And we've seen how fantastic he is at that. Jon has managed to convey those very important messages with an incredibly deft and light touch. He has made us laugh, he has encouraged us to think, and his words have made us all ponder the nature of human interactions. Not surprisingly for a scholar of oratory, he has delivered quite the performance, a performance that in my mind has embodied the enduring power of the lecture as a form to communicate, to engage, and to challenge. Could you please join me in thanking Jon?